All right, folks, how you doing? Galen Clavio here. We are set and ready to go for episode 7 of our World Cup analysis series. A lot of things happened today. We got done with the first set of games for the group stage. We're charging forward into the second set. In fact, we got one of those done already today. Lots of things to talk about. We're going to go through each of the games as they happen today, and then we're also going to reset our brackets. We're going to take some questions from those of you who are watching, both on Twitter and in the Periscope itself. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. You can either leave a question in the chat on the Periscope, or you can tweet it at me at Dr. GC, which you can see down there in the corner. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. A lot of different avenues we could go on with this, but we're going to start off with the first, really, I think, truly surprising appearance of a team, and that's Senegal. And maybe it's unfair to call it surprising, because the Senegalese, we certainly thought, had the ability to play as well as they did. I wasn't expecting them to actually execute on that all the way through, and by and large, they absolutely did that. So let's go ahead and dive right into that. Poland versus Senegal. Senegal ends up winning by the final count of 2-1. And, a few things to break down in this game immediately. First and foremost, the Senegalese really showed a lot of athleticism and speed in this game, and they looked like they really knew how to use it properly. And I think that was the big thing. And sometimes we see this with certain teams in the World Cup historically, where they will have good moments here and there, but then they will struggle to put it all together when it matters. And as someone pointed out, Legendian Moses in the chat, Senegal was in the quarterfinal in 2002. It's true. And then they haven't been back to the World Cup since then, I don't believe. But they really look like they belonged in this game. I was really happy to see them playing as well as they did. And, really from the get-go, I felt like they outclassed Poland in a number of areas. It was kind of interesting because the Poles came in with a really good reputation. They played very well in qualifying. They had Lewandowski on their squad, who's one of the best strikers in the world. But they couldn't break down the Senegalese defense. They would make 3/4 of a good move down the pitch, and then they would end up running into problems, and that wouldn't let them complete. And that was really kind of the story of the match for quite a while. Senegal able to take advantage of that. They get the lead, and then there's the big controversial play that occurs on the second goal, where there's a man led onto the pitch, and it was kind of at an odd moment from what we normally see in these games. Normally, you have an injured player go off. It doesn't mean they have to stay off forever. They generally come back on. They get waved on by the official. They normally don't get waved on by the official in a potential moment when there might be a breakaway. And that's exactly what happened here. There was a breakaway that took place, and just a nice job of getting past the keeper and putting it in the back of the net. And really that sunk the game for Poland at that point. I felt like the way that they were building in that second half, they probably were going to get an equalizer. We were going to end up with a 1-1 game. Not ideal for either team, but enough to kind of, propel them forward into the next couple of games. And yet, that's not what happened. Poland did end up scoring later on in the contest. They get that header towards the end, but it wasn't enough. Senegal able to hang on and, really kind of, for a lot of people, I think, upset the apple cart in terms of what they thought this group was going to be in combination with what happened in the first game of the day, which we'll get to here in just a second. I don't think anything controversial as far as like Senegal, they didn't cheat. That wasn't their fault. The referee waved the player on. But this did continue a trend that we're starting to see in these games, and we see it in every World Cup, so it's not that big of a surprise, but it's still disappointing. Some referees have been very good. Some of them have really lost control of games as they've gone along. And I think in this game that was definitely the case. I think we certainly saw it to some degree in the final game of the day here today as well, where you just had a situation where I don't think the referee quite had a handle on what needed to be done. Waving the player on at that particular point in time was a game-changing moment, and ideally you're not creating game-changing moments by allowing injured players back onto the pitch, during the run of play like that in that particular situation. So Poland a bit unlucky. I still think that the Senegal, despite some concerns that I had about the way that they were organized at certain points, I thought that they deserved the victory. I thought they outplayed Poland. And Poland's really got a lot of work to do. I don't think things are over for them by any means, but they're going to have to play much better in their final two games, and they're not going up against opponents where that's going to come naturally to them, I don't think. So something to keep an eye on. And what we thought was going to be a really good game ended up being a really good game overall. Just, I think, better for Senegal than for Poland. Couple of comments. Josh Margolis watching, and Mane was fantastic off the ball. He absolutely was. There were several players that we saw in that contest, I thought, that played really, really well. You look down the stat sheet. I mean, Poland actually outshot Senegal. They had more shots on target. They had a significantly larger amount of possession, 61% to 39%. But you break down the lineups and the way that everything worked out for these two teams. You really had to be happy with how the Senegalese were able to play throughout the course of the contest, and I think that bodes well for them in the next couple of games. So let's go ahead and jump forward, or actually, I guess we're going to jump backwards with our next one here and talk about issues that Colombia has. This is a Colombian team that a lot of people had an eye on and said, hey, this Colombian team could challenge maybe to get to the quarterfinals, maybe to get to the semifinals. A motif we keep coming back to on these analyses is this idea that South and Central American teams are having some problems being on the European continent. This is a historical trend. It goes back quite a ways historically in the World Cup. And man, I don't know that Colombia could have gotten a worse start to this game than they did. A really bad decision by the Colombian defender to stick his hand out early on in the game, in a game that was not going to come down to one goal. It just made zero sense to pick up a red card there when he did. I mean, just a very questionable decision. And ultimately, it creates a situation with Sanchez. I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to recover defensively. It looks like there's a clear shot on goal. So you stick and I don't even think that he consciously meant to do it. I mean, you're talking about situations that are happening so quickly that, frankly, it's more instinct than actually thinking about it. And the idea that it's like going back to Suarez in 2010. I mean, you instinctively try to keep the ball from going over the line, so you stick your hand out. It's not like he's some evil genius in the back room plotting for months, like, oh, I'm going to get a handball on the line. But Sanchez here, you've got to try to fight instinct there, because with 86 minutes remaining, or however much longer there was in the game, you can't afford to put your squad a man down. And Colombia really struggled with that for the entirety of the remainder of the game. They put themselves in a bad position. I give them a lot of credit. I mean, they fought back well. They made some quality substitutions, and that free kick. First of all, the free kick probably shouldn't have been given. I'm talking about the one in the 39th minute. That was a foul on Falcao. It was not a foul on the defender. Falcao backed into him while he was going after the ball, and it was clever, though, by Falcao. I don't begrudge him the attempt, but it was another instance of a referee not keeping a good control over things and not keeping an eye on what he needed to keep an eye on. So they get the free kick, and you got to give Quintero a lot of credit. It's actually, I think, pretty gutsy to send a worm burner underneath the wall. If it doesn't work, you look like a bit of a fool. But it worked this time. It worked beautifully, targeted perfectly, impossible for the keeper to get to. And at that point, this Japan team they're a shadow of their former selves, even though they've got some good stars. They're older stars. And, you thought, okay, Colombia's 10 men. They're going to just bunker in. And it looked like that was how things were going to be. Because Japan was really for a long time having trouble breaking Colombia down. And Colombia, despite having 10 men, I thought did a pretty good job of holding their organizational focus. They kept their shape. They collapsed very quickly. And even though they brought James Rodriguez on in the 59th minute, you're still looking at that and you're saying, well, this is probably just going to end up being a trench warfare battle where neither team's able to advance. It ends up in a 1-1 draw, and Colombia ends up surviving. And then that free kick, or that corner kick happened, and as was pointed out on a couple of the broadcasts, what were you doing if you were Colombia there? How do you not put at least one man on a post, if not two? We've seen a lot of corner kicks and free kicks in general, or set pieces in general, result in goals, and a lot of it's just, there was a tweet I retweeted earlier on that I thought captured, I think it might have been James Tyler, where he said, with the exception of Cristiano Ronaldo's free kick and maybe one other one, particularly on corners, this is not about skill, it's about concentration and effort. And just bad concentration, bad effort by Colombia, allowing that goal, and so late in the match, too. I mean, you're talking about the 73rd minute of a match where you're already down a man, and Colombia just couldn't break through. They tried. They had a couple of possible goal-scoring chances that they just were never able to convert. And Colombia, that creates problems for them, particularly in light of what happened in the second game with Senegal winning. That does create an issue for this Colombian squad in terms of the points that are out there and what they're going to be able to do moving forward. So we'll keep an eye on that and talk about it a little bit more when we get to our prediction segment of this broadcast. Let's go ahead and jump to our third game of the day, Russia versus Egypt. And man, before the tournament, I predicted Russia was going to come out of this group. I predicted they were going to come out second. And I felt like I was on an island with that to a large degree. Everybody was picking Egypt. Everybody thought, Mo Salah is going to come back and he's going to be in goal-scoring form, and Egypt's going to be stronger than Russia as a result of that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the Russians aren't a great team by any means, but they're not completely helpless. And as was pointed out in the chat, if you're a one-man team like Egypt is with Salah, it's going to be really hard to win, or at least get the requisite number of points that you need to get out of a group. And I think that we're seeing that manifest itself here. The Russians have figured out how to play with each other. I don't think that they're a threat to win the World Cup or anything, but the fact that they've meshed, the fact that they seem to be playing as a single unit, and the fact that they're playing, in their home country, all of those things really matter. And it really showed today. They were by far the better team until about the 70th minute, and then I think Egypt finally raised their game and started playing them as equals. But by that point, it was too late. That you've got 8 goals scored now by the Russians, the most of any team. Granted, but even the 5 goals that they scored in the first game is still the most of any team. And yeah, granted, that came against Saudi Arabia, but that game still counts. So 8 goals scored now for Russia. And, it brings up some interesting questions. Is Russia really this good, or are Saudi Arabia this poor? Is Egypt this poor? I'm not totally sure. I don't think that Russia's a great team, but I look at them and they're probably middle of the pack the way they're playing right now. They're playing above their heads, but that's part of this process. That's part of this World Cup process. And we've seen teams play out of their heads and play pretty well, even going into the knockout stage in the past. We certainly saw it in 2002 with both Korea and Japan. We saw it in 1994 with the United States when they were hosting. And, really the only year we haven't seen it would have been 2010. And even then, South Africa was able to, I think they either beat or drew France. I forget which one. But they even in the group stage, they played better than we thought. That was a pretty bad South African team that year. So this bounce that you get from being on your home soil is really big. That said, I still would attribute what's going on with the Russians more to their opponents than to them, because Saudi Arabia is probably the worst team in the tournament, and Egypt, as a one-man team who was missing their one man in the first game, even in this game, we saw that the rest of the pieces just aren't there for this Egyptian squad. So I do think that what we're seeing at this point is Russia's going to win this group, as was pointed out in chat. And that's going to change a few things as far as the brackets are concerned. So let's go ahead and jump over to that and take a look at where the brackets are set up. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about what my predictions were at the beginning, and then we'll look at how they've changed over the course of the first round of games. So this was what I had as my pre-tournament prediction for who was going to come out first and second of each group and how they would match up with the respective sides of the bracket. So you can see here, obviously I had Uruguay winning Group A with Russia as the second place team, Spain, and then Portugal in B, and so on and so forth down the list here. So take a look at that, and then let's take a look at how things have changed. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight the differences that I have so far in yellow, and you're going to see there's quite a few differences. Most of them are more place than teams, but there are a couple of teams that after watching this first round of games and the first game of the second round of the group stage, there are a couple of teams that I've got changing spots. So here's what we're looking at right now as far as I'm concerned, and this is taking into account what we saw in the first round, the matchups that are remaining for all of these teams, and the way that I think all of this is going to fit together. So right now, I think it's almost inescapable that Russia is going to win Group A. Right now, Russia is +7 on goal differential, and even if Uruguay wins, they'd have to beat Saudi Arabia by a significant margin in order to get that back to something that they could even achieve, and then they'd have to go out and they'd have to beat Russia on the final day of group stage. And I don't know if this Russian team is going to be beaten, particularly for a team like Uruguay, who looks a little old, looks a little on the slow side. I still think Uruguay gets out, but rather than being the Group A winner, I think that they're going to come out in second place. And that's going to create some interesting matchups in that second round, because now instead of Russia having to play Spain, Russia gets a shot at playing Portugal, and that's a much better matchup for this Russian squad. Obviously Portugal is still a very good team. They won the Euros in 2016. They look like they could score, play for play with Spain in that first group stage matchup that they had against the Spanish. But if I'm Russia, I'd rather be playing that Portuguese squad than playing Spain. Spain, to me, looks like a team that's going to give teams with questionable defenses a lot of problems. And whatever you think of the Russians, their defense is almost entirely unproven right now. They did a good job against Salah today, but that was the only player they had to keep account of. They don't get that luxury if they have to play Spain. So that's the big switch there in Group A. I've got Group B as the same. I've got my order in Group C as the same, but I've flipped my Group D team. So now I've got Croatia winning that group and Argentina coming out of that group in second place. Group E, I've still got Brazil winning despite the Neymar injury today, but I've got Switzerland coming out now instead of Serbia. I went through and I picked all of the games individually. That was just how I had it set up based upon goal differential and so on and so forth. We do have a flip with Group F, Mexico coming out in the first spot. I think that the things are set up very nicely for them to do so. They get to play South Korea in their next game. Germany has to play Sweden. I do think the Germans get out, but I think they're going to end up in that second position. And then I've still got Belgium and England in the order that I had them picked before, but I think that Senegal, instead of coming out in second spot, is going to come out in first. And now I don't think the Poles get out at all. I do think, and this is a really tough group to pick, I think Group H is probably the toughest of the groups, but I think that looking at the matchups and looking at the teams and looking at the fact that we didn't really get a great look at Colombia today because we saw them with 11 men for a grand total of like 4 minutes. And given the fact we did see Poland for the whole time and they were really not that impressive, I think Colombia figures out a way to get that second spot coming out of Group H. So you've got a really interesting set of games here, I think, in this knockout stage as I've projected it right now. And yeah, as Josh Margolis points out in the chat, that's a potential Brazil-Germany knockout round rematch. That is why it is so important for Germany that they figure out a way to win that group, or they hope that somehow Brazil, due to Neymar being injured or just indifference, ends up finishing second in that group instead of first. I think Brazil is going to figure out a way to finish first in that group. And yeah, that is, not just Brazil-Germany as a rematch in the knockout first round, but man, France versus Argentina as a round of 16 matchup is pretty remarkable as well. And I think Belgium-Colombia would be quite fascinating also. The right side of the bracket, not quite as interesting from a name perspective, but stylistically, I think would be really, really fascinating. I'd love to watch Senegal, England and see how those teams match up against each other, and how the English, counter the athletic threat that Senegal provides. So that's where we're at right now as far as brackets concerned. I will go ahead and do another reset of the bracket after the second round of group games is done. And that's, of course, going to be coming up in about a week or so. We've got several games to go through before we get to that point. And in fact, we finish up this group of games that's coming up on Sunday. The last H game will be at 2:00 on Sunday, and then we'll dive in to the final set of games. And the final set of games, for those of you who are new to the World Cup, it's important to remember that the way that we're doing it right now, we're playing one game, then one game, then one game, then the day is over. When we get to the final set of group stage games, they play the games simultaneously within the groups so that we don't have a situation where you could have a team watch their opponent lose and say, oh, we don't have to try that hard, therefore we're not going to actually participate in this game. They try to basically keep the competition as quote-unquote honest as possible. So starting on Monday, we'll have 2 games at 10 o'clock, and that'll be the last games out of Group A, and then 2 games at 2 o'clock, and that'll be the last games out of Group B, and so on and so forth throughout the course of that week. So getting to our Wednesday preview, the games that we've got coming up tomorrow, a lot of games that will be worth watching and very interesting to watch, I think. You've got the first game of the day, I think, is the most interesting one, just because Portugal playing Morocco. Morocco still has a chance to get back into the midst of this group, despite losing to Iran, because Portugal and Spain both drew against each other in that first game. And so what you end up with is a situation where if Morocco wins that game, or even if they draw in that game, they keep themselves in the conversation. If they draw Portugal, then Portugal has 2 points, Morocco has 1. And then if Spain does what we expect them to do and beats Iran, you've got 2 teams with 3 points, a team with 2 points, a team with 1 point, and nothing decided going into the final stage of that group. So that's the 8 o'clock game. I would expect Portugal will be the better side in this contest, but the Portuguese historically have been somewhat unpredictable when it comes to how they play in major tournaments. Certainly, they won the Euros the last time around, and you got to give them some credit for that. But there's no guarantee that the emotional high of basically playing Spain toe-to-toe isn't going to wear off and result in some kind of a letdown of sorts, I guess, against Morocco. So that one's worth keeping an eye on. Uruguay, Saudi Arabia, we know the Saudis are not a good team. The questions are, will Uruguay come out properly motivated to try to pick up not just goals, or not just a win, but also goals, or do we see a situation where they're just going to settle for second place in the group? So we'll keep an eye on that. That's the 11 o'clock game. And then we've got Spain versus Iran. Iran, the surprise winner in that first matchup that they had against Morocco. Can they keep the magic going at all? Can they frustrate the Spanish? Probably not in either case, but Iran right now is leading that group. And, until someone comes and takes that away from them, they're going to continue to lead the group. So, again, do we see Spain, try to pour it on, try to get some goal differential, try to separate themselves from the Portuguese? Do we see Iran just play a frustrating style of soccer against the Spanish, and does that have some sort of an impact? I'm curious to see what happens with that. So that's our matchups for the games tomorrow, and that's going to more or less wrap us up for today. Thanks to everybody for joining us on this special broadcast, World Cup Analysis Day 7. We'll be back with Day 8 tomorrow, so feel free to tune in at that point. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, we did have actually 2 other small things I'm going to touch on. I did have a couple of questions. One was from Greg Gottfried. Actually, I guess this folds right into what I was going to say. Why have there been so many own goals? Is this just an anomaly, or is it due to a change in playing style? I mean, to me, it has to be an anomaly. The own goal situation, because look at it like this. In the prior World Cups that we've had, all of them, from 1930 until the present, there had been 44 total own goals in all of those tournaments, and that's 1.9% of all goals scored total. what we've seen so far in this tournament is basically 12% of goals that have been scored have been own goals, 5 out of, I think, 42. That seems more like an anomalous situation. I do think to some degree you're more likely to get own goals in these sorts of tournaments simply because teams aren't used to playing with one another. These are glorified all-star teams. There's not the sort of synchronicity, and particularly on defense, a lot of times guys will accidentally end up in the wrong position. And most of these own goals have been deflections off of players. It isn't like players are purposely trying to kick the ball into their own net. So I think that what we're looking at here is a very anomalous situation. We still haven't hit the record for most own goals. That was set back in 1998. There were 6 own goals in that tournament, but we're not even through, halfway through the group stage, and we're already at 5. So it is something to keep an eye on. And a lot of people were joking that own goal right now is leading the tournament in scoring, which is true. But I'll be surprised if we continue to see a lot of own goals scored. But if we do, I think it's more randomness than anything else. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with us, just tweet me at Dr. GC. You can comment on Periscope. We'll be back tomorrow, probably around the same time, about 4 o'clock Eastern, which I think is 9 or 10 o'clock in Europe, depending on where you're watching in Europe, or relatively early in the morning if you're watching in Asia. So thanks to everybody for joining me. I'm Galen Clavio, and we'll catch you folks on the flip side.